last fall has come into the fold as well. Pat Lepore, who is a friend of, say your name? Masha.
Yeah.
Yes, Masha. Thank you. I met you last. But we welcome both of these new members into the society. Thank you very much for coming. We also have with us a guest, a man named Ken Skinner, who saw the article in the paper and was very interested in the subject matter and who decided to come, and we welcome him tonight as well. At this time, I will ask Jan Blake to come forward and to give the Secretary's report.
The Bedford Historical Society General Meeting held at St. Paul's Church was called to order at 8 p.m. on Friday the 11th, 1998. Robert Svensson welcomed the group and noted that Ruby Walters was a new guest. Charles Thiebaud was introduced, and so was our new video and recorder equipment. James Shea was thanked for his help and advice in acquiring our new setup. Our evening's events were all duly recorded. The Treasurer Helen Now has reported that we had $32,859 in our accounts. Robert Svensson spoke to us about the upcoming Millennium Celebration and our need for volunteers and leadership. Our April meeting, to be held on the 22nd, will be at the Waltham Industrial Museum, and Doris Crowell talked briefly about what wonders await us on that evening. Betty Svensson, Seal Walker, and Jan Blake were thanked for the dessert and Valentine goodies. There was also a drawing in which Mimi Adler, Marcel Schnicka, and Nancy French were delighted recipients of charming Valentine gifts. John Filios and Don Corey, members of the Bedford Historical Preservationist Committee, spoke briefly of two issues concerning new shingles for the Joe Blaine House and monies for work and preservation of the Old Town Hall. Don and John encouraged us to attend the town meeting on March 23rd to help pass these articles. It was also mentioned that Mary Hafer is looking for a table to hold our copying machine, which is located at the museum. Cecile Walker introduced John Dodge, our speaker for the evening, who shared with us the history of the Valentine. His collection of cards that he brought for us to look at were lacy, intricate, romantic, charming, funny, bad-tempered, and some even a little risque. 4 surprised and lucky people received large valentines from John at the end of the evening. The meeting adjourned at 9:30 p.m.
Sounds like a good report to me. Are there any omissions or corrections? Please.
Sir, technicality, Jan, you said the meeting was held on Friday the 11th. Was that a slip of the tongue?
It was a slip of the tongue. The date is right, but the date is wrong. No, I didn't. I said February 11th.
Oh, you said Friday.
Oh, did I? My slip of the tongue, but the right here on the paper.
Good. Then we don't have to change it.
No, we don't have to change it.
Anything else?
Yeah, I'd like to say that the prize that was won by Nancy French, I will bring.
Oh.
I took it home because you left. You left last meeting, and I have the prize.
You'll be surprised and delighted, Nancy.
Good recovery. If there are no other omissions or corrections, then could I please have a motion that we accept those minutes? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. The next subject on the agenda is the Treasurer's report. Helen Nowers has illness in the family, but sent to me a printed report, and it says that the society has close to $33,000 with $32,241 in fidelity, cash reserves yielding 5.4%, and $686 in the Boston Federal Savings Bank, earning a small amount of interest as well. I wanted to just add to that report my own remarks about the Treasury, and I wanted to say that since I've become president, I've heard a lot of comments about all the money this society has, and I get questions about it, and I get amazement, and I get remarks about it, and I just want to say that yes, it seems like there's a lot of money there, but it's committed, I think. We need the following things, and they're in our plans. We have the plans, but we don't always have the energy to go forward and to move ahead on these things. But new cabinets for the museum, for displaying the artifacts, is one thing that the money is earmarked for. A second item is to repair and restore museum antiques, including some furniture pieces that we intend to put in our museum. Capital equipment for the archives, coming from the plate money, including microfilming equipment and a computer. A plaque for the old burying ground. That was almost ready to be ordered and the money spent, but it was discovered that the list of Revolutionary soldiers was not an accurate list, and so they need to make sure it becomes accurate before they put their names on the plaque. Now, if there's anything left after all of those things, we still have a dream of having a heritage house, and we need funds to maintain that heritage house when we do have it. So $33,000 is not a lot of money, and I wouldn't want any of you to stop paying your dues. In the same vein, I wanted to report to you about the request of Mary Hafer, who asked for a table to put the photocopying machine on. And some of you said that we could buy one of those with the money we have, and you're right, we could. But it was more fun to go this route, and I had 6 people participate in different ways with ideas about a table, and one person said that they would make a table, a couple more people brought tables, and some suggested where a table could be obtained at modest cost. But there is a table now that's supporting the photocopying machine, and it was nice to receive that donation. Mary is away with her parents, and I know that she'll be glad about that too. At this time, I'd like to thank the hospitality group tonight, which consisted of B. Brown, Wilma Johnson, Aldi, thank you for bringing Wilma's goodies, and Betty Svensson. And I would also like to thank Laura Durgan, who filled in again for Lucia Kespert as the greeter for the evening. Now, on the subject of the millennium, which I talked with you about last time and was mentioned in the minutes, I did not receive any interest in the society taking a lead position in celebrating the millennium. But I did receive in the mail and by telephone and what looks to me to be a good alternative, and that is in Lexington, the Women's Republican Club is sponsoring a meeting called 2000 Celebration to be presented by Skip Hayward, who was the captain of the militia in Lexington, and is also a very good organizer. And he wants to take it upon himself to lead the town of Lexington and all of the surrounding towns in observing and celebrating the millennium. The list of towns who would participate: Bedford, Concord, Lexington, Lincoln, Medford, and Weston, and maybe others. And this presentation, which I will attend with my wife, is to be held next Tuesday evening, March 24th. And I respect the fact that that's on a on a night when we have the town meetings. But I still say that if you don't go to town meeting, you're welcome to go to this. Refreshments will be served by the Women's Republican Club. And so if there's any interest in that, I hope you'll let me know, and perhaps we can go together. It's at the Heritage Hall at 177 Bedford Street in Lexington, and it's to be held at 7:30 p.m. Well, the speaker will be glad that we're moving forward very well tonight. He wants to begin, and so that he can give us a good presentation. We have just one other announcement, and that one is not by me, I'm glad to tell you, but rather by Don Corey. Please come forward.
Thank you. The purpose is just to give you an update on progress on the funding for doing additional work for the old town hall. The Historic Preservation Commission had, in anticipation of getting some state funds, had gone out and advertised for consultants to come forward with proposals for doing the work at Old Town Hall this past month. Last week, the state announced their grants for this current round of funding for historic preservation projects, and glad to report that Senator Fargo's office contacted John Filios and confirmed that the state had awarded Bedford $17,500, which is what we requested. 50% grant, the town has to come up with the other portion for a $35,000 project. This is to evaluate what has to be done to the town hall in order to make it handicapped accessible and meet the state building codes as far as having safe egress and all the other requirements of the current building codes. So we were awarded the state funding that we requested. We also, in anticipation of the funding, had gone out on a limb, had done a lot of work and gone out and requested proposals, and we did. The closing date for submission of proposals was Monday. We received a proposal from the Preservation Partnership. Some of you may know Max Farrow, who's the principal in that organization, and he has submitted a proposal for that. So we have two legs of the stool. The third leg is that at town meeting, we have to get the approval to take some of the money, the $104,000 that was appropriated 2 years ago to work on the old town hall, on the exterior, to authorize the selectmen to use some of that as the match for the state funds so we can proceed on this project. Once that's done, and of course town meeting starts on Monday, this is one of the early articles, we'll have the third leg of the stool, and so we can proceed on this project. So hope as many of you that can make it to town meeting will be there, and that we can get this whole thing underway again. Thank you.
Any questions for Don?
The important thing of that whole business is we have to have the town agree to having a preservation restriction on the old town hall, which means if the state spends money on it, we have to be sure that it's going to stay as the town hall and the structure as part of our town common area. So we have a commitment that has to be made by the town. So it's very important you come to town meeting. Very.
Thank you for speaking up, Mimi. I'm sorry we didn't capture that on film. But, I should have had you come forward. Are there any other comments or questions before we turn the evening over to Cecile Walker? Cecile, I think you want to mention something about the next trip and also to present the speaker at this time.
Okay.
I think I've already spoken to most of you because I think most of you signed up for the trip in April to the museum in Waltham. And if some of you are undecided, or I have to know by the 15th. But I went there to look at it first before I thought we should go, and it's wonderful. Really, it's wonderful. Isn't that right, Aldi? I know you really enjoy it. Now, meeting speaker tonight, where'd he go?
He's running the projector.
Oh, all right. I already paid him. Lee Aldrich writes such a wonderful newsletter. Lee, you do a wonderful job. So I'm just going to run over this a little bit, the way he presented it in the paper, in case some of you didn't read it or forgot. Our guest speaker is Mr. J.R. Green. He will present a narrated slideshow on the creation of the Quabbin Reservoir and the history of the towns that it flooded, featuring contemporary illustrations of lost towns and villages, construction of water supply reservoirs and facilities, and a few views of the area in recent times. Mr. Green is the author of 6 books, 3 atlases, 2 bibliographies, and many articles on historic topics, mainly related to the Quabbin Reservoir. He has served on the board of directors of the Swift River Valley Historical Society, the Friends of Quabbin, and the Athol Historical Society, and has been the gubernatorial appointee to the Metropolitan Water Resources Authority Advisory Board for the Quabbin Ware River Watershed seats since 1991. That was all one sentence. Anyway, I found myself very interested in this, wondering, what does our water flow over? So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Green again.
Thank you. If we can have the lights. Our cameraman can adjust his camera. Hopefully you can all see this, and hopefully you'll all be able to hear me. I'm told my voice can carry in a room. I've been in many town positions in my hometown of Athol from selectmen on down, so I guess they've been able to hear me sometimes. This slide shows a few of the books I've written on the subject. As you can probably tell from looking at me, although maybe you can't, I'm not old enough to have been there. I did not come from the towns, although my hometown of Athol is just north of the Quabbin Reservoir, Route 2. So I've interviewed many people who came from that area and have done an awful lot of research on the subject. That's how I produce these books. And one thing I would ask that you hold all questions until the end of the program. I'll get up front for a few minutes and try to answer any questions you may have. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is about an hour. We'll show you a series of slides. First, how the Quabbin Reservoir got there, how Metropolitan Boston's water system is stretched that far out. And then most of the rest of the program will be what the towns that were taken and flooded and destroyed by the project looked like, and a little bit at the end of what the area looks like today. The Metropolitan Boston water supply, of course, you would think, well, they're right next to the ocean, but you can't drink salt water. The Charles and Mystic Rivers flowed into Boston and Boston Harbor early on, but of course they were built up and polluted also. As early as right after the Revolutionary War, they went out to Jamaica Pond in Roxbury, then a separate town, to obtain water, and they also got water out of Spot Pond up in the Winchester area by the 1820s. And then they had a 20-year fight over whether to go private or municipal for their water supplies. They chose the municipal route. In 1845, got approval from the legislature to go out to Natick, to what was called Long Pond, which they raised by building this dam you see here, and used a pipeline made out of hollowed out logs to bring water into Boston. The way the system leaks, some people think they're still using those hollowed out logs, but that's not true. In any case, in 1848, when this was finished, they had a huge gusher fountain on Boston Common to show that the hub of the universe, as they called themselves, was a fully equipped city with the latest in water supply. Of course, that's an early example of wasting water, too. We won't get into that. They also renamed Long Pond Lake Cochituate, giving it an old Native American name. Those of you who remember the Carling beer commercials brewed on the shores of Lake Cochituate, they were trading on the fact that this had been a water supply, although it was abandoned in the 1920s because of the encroachment of development on its watershed. But this set a precedent. Go west to pure upland, gravity-fed sources for Metropolitan Boston's water supply. Of course, at the time, it was just Boston alone. All the other cities and towns were using their own sources. And of course, when that reservoir was finished, the Irish coming over from the potato famine were just getting here. And of course, other immigrants came. The city grew, started absorbing nearby communities like Charlestown and Dorchester and such. And the Civil War brought industrialization and great fires. They didn't have enough water to fight them. So in the 1870s and 80s, they proceeded to build several small reservoirs in the Sudbury River watershed near Framingham and Natick. And this reservoir, you go right by it if you ever go that way on the Massachusetts Turnpike, between Boston and Worcester. This is one of the reservoirs they built, which is still there. Currently, the Sudbury system is not an active part of the watershed, the reservoir system, but it is a backup supply. So they don't have really enough land to protect it properly, but it is there if they need it during another drought. So that was completed by 1890, and at that time, due to the growth, immigration, industrialization, and also the suburbs, the streetcar suburbs increasing in size, and encroaching upon their own water supplies, not only Boston, but many of its suburbs seemed to need more water. So the State Board of Health was called in. They did a study. They looked at places as far away as Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire and Sebago Lake in Maine. And however, since Boston does not control those states like it controls the rest of this state, they couldn't go and get water from them. The Merrimack River was looked at. It was clean enough for Low Lawrence and Haverhill, but it was not deemed clean enough for Boston to drink. So they decided to go west of this supply to the Nashua River above Clinton, near Worcester. The village of West Boylston, in the town of West Boylston, these two churches had been built fairly recently to this time, and there were several mills in the village, about 1,000 or so people. But because it was in the basin of the Nashua River and the site chosen for this future reservoir, it was going to be materially affected. Legislation was passed in 1895 that combined the city of Boston water supply with that to be built by this, and allowed any community within 10 miles of the State House to join into this metropolitan water system. And a Metropolitan Water Board was created, one of the first quasi-regional state agencies in our state's history. And they proceeded to tear apart 6.5 square miles of land in Sterling, Clinton, Boylston, and West Boylston, including this village, which I'll get back to, and build a large dam to flood in this basin. And they named it after nearby Wachusett Mountain in Princeton, which overlooks this, and called it Wachusett Reservoir, using another old Native American name. It's interesting, they wiped those people out, but they used their names everywhere. Anyway, this is a shot of the dam shortly after it was completed. It was filled by 1908, and you can see the spillway on the right where the water goes over when that reservoir is full, and it goes down around outside the picture to the left into the basin of the Nashua River. The little red top building is the control building for the aqueduct, which takes the water out of Wachusett Reservoir toward metropolitan Boston. And of course, now they're building the Metro West Tunnel to be a supplement to this, so that they'll have 2 tunnels to do it instead of just one in case something happened. This reservoir holds about 67 billion gallons when it's filled. They had to relocate a railroad, the Central Mass Division of the Boston and Maine, around the basin of it, which you can see a little bridge at the bottom of the picture. That, of course, is since gone for over 20 years, but nonetheless, it's an interesting structure there. No whole towns were destroyed for this project. West Boylston Center sort of picked itself up, and the people moved up on the high ground overlooking the reservoir where it is today. And due to all the nice water views, it's a rather tony suburb of Worcester with all these high prime real estate. And it's interesting, a year after this was filled, they were making surveys in the Swift River Valley, 25 miles to the west, because it had been suggested as the next future site for water supply in the 1895 report. This is that church I showed you earlier. The Catholic church, which was made out of wood, was torn down, and the Baptist church was left standing. Maybe the engineers were Protestants, I don't know, or maybe because this one was stone, but nonetheless, it was left there on the shore of the reservoir as a sort of monument to the original site of West Boylston Village. And it sat there empty, no museum, no nothing, just an empty hulk, no windows, for about 70 years, and people said it's going to collapse, it's going to cave in, and the state did nothing, and sure enough, in the early 60s, it caved in. Then they spent $250,000 to rebuild it as an empty, windowless hulk, which it is today. So lovers and pot smokers and pigeons and whatever go in there. No museum, no nothing, just a big empty hulk sitting on the shore of the reservoir. So talk about historic preservation. Well, they preserved it, but that's about all they've done. So that's the Wachusett Reservoir, completed in 1908, the next major step westward in the Metropolitan Boston system. Now, here's a map, which is in a couple of my books to orient you. Here's Boston, the big black blob, the cause of most of this. There's Natick, where that first reservoir was built, 1848, the Sudbury River. There's Wachusett Reservoir, just north of Worcester, and you can see the Merrimack River up here. Now, at the time of World War I, Boston was still growing at an ex-Hyde Park, I believe around 1912 or 13, its last major addition. The suburbs were growing. Worcester was also looking for water after it had built several reservoirs in Leicester and Paxton and Holden, and they were looking up in this area of the Ware River watershed, which was the next step projected for this metropolitan water system. Well, in 1919, when Calvin Coolidge was governor, the State Board of Health and the brand new Metropolitan District Commission, which included the old water and the sewer boards and such, were created as a joint board to study this situation. They came up with a report in 1922. They said, we will divert water from the Ware River in Barry, we will build the dams below Enfield and flood the Swift River Valley and build a reservoir, and we'll divert water upstream from JR's hometown of Athol on the Millers River and make a nice big reservoir, and then we'll tunnel all the water over to Wachusett. Well, that didn't sit very well with anybody. The people in Boston said $65 million. That's a lot of money, folks. Remember, this is Calvin Coolidge dollars, not Bill Clinton dollars here. The people in Worcester said, we're not going to get anything out of it. People in the Ware River said, hey, all our industries are going to get their water power generation capability cut down. People in the Swift River Valley said, we don't want to get flooded out. And the people up here said that we don't want to lose our water power generation capability either. So our legislature, in its wisdom, decided to wrangle about it for 5 years. They commissioned 2 more studies, and finally in 1926 and 1927 they passed 2 laws, the Ware River Act and the Swift River Act, which basically ended up doing, by the way, they also looked at the Merrimack River and the Ipswich River and the Assabet Rivers, but those didn't end up being considered. Basically, they took most of the original plan. The Millers River got left out. The Swift River Valley was to be flooded. The Ware River was to be diverted. Worcester was given a chunk of Wachusett Reservoir's watershed to draw water from to keep them happy. And to run this whole job, they hired a man who had just completed Providence, Rhode Island's Quabbin, called the Scituate Reservoir. That's their major water supply for that city. A man named Frank E. Windsor. This is the valley that was affected by the project. Those of you familiar with going into the northwestern part of the state on Route 2 probably know you go west of Fitchburg, Gardner, then Templeton, Phillipston, Athol, Orange, and through that way. The 4 towns that were totally wiped out for this project, the Quabbin Reservoir, were Dana in Worcester County and Greenwich, not Greenwich, Prescott, and Enfield in Hampshire County. Now, because reservoirs respect flat land and not town boundaries, parts of 7 other towns were flooded for the project. Orange and Wendell didn't get flooded, but they lost some land for watershed takings. New Salem and Shutesbury in Franklin County were partly flooded or bought up. Pelham, Belchertown, and Ware in Hampshire counties, and Hardwick, Barry, and Petersham in Worcester counties also lost some territory for this. Now, to the east on the Ware River, the diversion, they did not destroy any whole towns, but they bought up 21,000 acres of land in Hubbardston, Barry, Oakham, and off the map in Rutland for the watershed protection of this diversion. They destroyed a village in each town, but no major portion of it. So this is the scene of the crime, so to speak, at least from my point of view. And you'll notice there was a railroad connecting Athol through that valley to Springfield, the Athol branch of the Boston and Albany Railroad, which I'll mention later. And the younger generation often wonders, well, were there protests? Did people go and lay themselves down in front of gates and get arrested and all this stuff like the anti-nuclear and anti-war people do? Well, this was the 1920s. As many of you know who were born in that era or just afterwards. People didn't do those kinds of things. They just sort of did what they were told or what the government told them to do. This man, Roland Astoria, was interesting. He was one of the major people speaking against it. He was a state representative from Ware, Massachusetts, and he represented 3 of those towns that were taken. And he opposed it quite strongly in the legislature, comparing the people proposing it to the Huns ravishing Belgium in World War I in such flowery language. However, when it was demonstrated to him that in order to save the Swift River Valley towns, his hometown of Ware would see a huge reduction in the flow of the Ware River to make up the difference, he sort of ended up going along with it. They had a few hearings in that area, and there was some protests, mainly from mill owners. The property owners in the valley, counting heads and seeing that Boston's area is 2 million people, had a lot more clout than their 2,000 or 3,000 people, they knew what was going to happen. They ended up trying to fight for better property taking provisions, which they didn't even get that, which is very typical of how things go in this state. The further west you go, the less you get. So the protests were there, but they were very muted and in meetings and that sort of forum. Now, this is not Kathleen Willey's legal defense team. This is, yeah, 2 weeks ago I said Monica Lewinsky. So this is a group of people who were instrumental in the construction of the Quabbin Reservoir. On the far right was Judge Davis Keniston. He was the first chairman of the Metropolitan District Water Supply Commission, which was set up to actually carry out these projects. They didn't want the Metropolitan District Commission or the State Board of Health to do it and control all the patronage. So they created a board with representatives from both so they could split it. Nice little Massachusetts political solution. This gentleman, Frank E. Windsor, the chief engineer for the project, got on board there in late 1926 when it got started, and he was a very good boss of the job right up until his death in early 1939. He dropped dead of a heart attack in a courtroom while testifying in an engineering case. Rather sad way to go. You can read more about that in my book, The Creation of Quabbin Reservoir. As a result, the engineers at the nearly completed dam decided to name the dam Windsor Dam after him, and that is the name it has today, and there is a monument to him overlooking that dam. Windsor's assistant and successor was Carl Kennison, no relation to Keniston on the right. I interviewed him shortly before he died, a number of years ago. A very able man. His historical researches in the area were probably the reason the name Quabbin Reservoir was given to the project. And he carried the thing to its conclusion in the mid-1940s and later went on to work for the city of New York and its water supply. The gentleman second from the left, I'll just say he was a division engineer. He fudged up some data on a contract that was discovered and he committed suicide. So we'll leave him at that. The gentleman on the far left was sort of the gray eminence of the whole project, a man named X.H. Goodnow. He was the chief engineer of the State Department of Public Health, or Board of Health, who was earlier known, for over 35 years. He was in on the planning for Watershed Reservoir. He was the head of the study that suggested what became Quabbin Reservoir. It was called the Goodnow Plan. And he was a relentless lobbyist for his plan. One legislator said he was so smooth he could sell Christmas trees in a synagogue. He let the Democrats think his first initial X stood for Xavier, the Boston Democrat legislators, to get their votes and things. His first name was actually Xanthus, which, if you remember your ancient Greek mythology in the Iliad, that was the name of a river god who flooded his banks to try to drown the hero Achilles during a battle in the Trojan War. Rather ironic name for this character, I think. Of course, he got to be named a consultant to the project after it started, but he died in the mid-30s before it was completed. A quarter of a century later, some misguided souls decided to call the second dam at Quabbin, which is known as Quabbin Dyke, Goodnow Dyke, after him, and there is now a small gravestone-like monument next to the dam there in his honor. So there's two of the faces behind the names at the Quabbin. Now I mentioned this Ware River diversion. This was the earlier sister project. The water from this was meant to be mixed with the Quabbin water and delivered eastward to Wachusett water. And it was put online many years before the Quabbin was finished so that they would have some water to augment the Wachusett supply before the Quabbin was done. And in doing this, I mentioned they didn't destroy any whole towns, but they did take several villages. Rutland lost about a third of its territory, including the villages of North and West Rutland. This is West Rutland, which was on the shore of Long Pond, one of the sources of the Ware River. On the far left, you can see a worsted mill. Of course, they made clothing products and such. In the middle was a boarding house for the mill workers, and on the right was the store and post office. This area is little known, but the buildings were all destroyed, the property has gone back to trees, and the only thing they left in this village was the cemetery on the shore of Long Pond. Colebrook Springs was the northernmost and most populous village in the town of Oakham, or Oakham as some people call it. This was several hundred yards upstream from the intake for the Ware River diversion, so they bought it all up. The road is now State Highway Route 122, but the buildings are all gone, the fields are all grown into pine trees and such. There was several mineral springs in this village and 2 hotels. It was quite a resort about 100 years ago. 2 railroads served it, including that Central Mass Division of the B&M. And supposedly the springs were very healthful and beneficial. One advertisement said they were excellent for feminine complaints. I don't know if that meant a guy was supposed to take his wife there and drown her, but that's how they advertised it. The springs are still there, by the way, but the water people have plugged them up with gravel so that they're not used anymore. So that was Colebrook Springs. White Valley was a small village in the town of Barry, which was just downstream from the diversion intake. It was all centered on this old cotton mill. And because they were going to take away so much of the water generating capability of this mill, they decided it was cheaper just to buy it than to pay damages, and they did. The wooden building on the right was torn down. The brick building without its chimney is still standing. That is now a storage building for the water people. To the cameraman's back would be the diversion intake, which I'll show you in a sec. And the road at the bottom of the picture is, again, State Highway Route 122. This is the diversion intake, shaft 8 as it's called, because there were 12 shafts running west from the Watershed Reservoir to the Quabbin Reservoir, built down from the surface to create the tunnel. So this is where the water would be diverted from the Ware River. Now, the engineers were very confident, even though the state of Connecticut sued Massachusetts shortly after this project was started, saying they were diverting too much water that would go into the Connecticut River into their state. And in spite of this suit, the engineers kept right on building this, and in 1931, the Supreme Court decided in their favor, and a few weeks later, this was opened up so that water could be diverted to Watershed Reservoir. This is a map, which I've tinted in green to show the land they purchased, over 21,000 acres. Rutland, the site of West Rutland Village. Barry is here, the site of White Valley Village. North Rutland over here. Here's Hubbardston, and Oakham is Colebrook Springs. And the tunnel line runs through here. That's Holden and Paxton, just northwest of Worcester. This area traditionally has had somewhat more recreational out in it than the Quabbin. They've had hunting and snowmobiling and things like that allowed in here, which they don't allow in the Quabbin over the years. Although the Quabbin has had a few special hunts in recent years. So this area is, again, the earlier junior version of the Quabbin, but no large bodies of water were created, so people don't tend to remember it as much. The Ware River diversion. This is a shot of the inside of the tunnel line. It's almost 25 miles long between the Quabbin Reservoir and Watershed Reservoir. And there's a map up on the door on the left you can look at afterwards, which shows you both the map and the profile of this, how it goes under the ground. This was blasted out of solid rock several hundred feet under the surface to keep it pure. Several people died, by the way, during the construction of this, either from the explosions or from the phenomenon of what divers call the bends. If you go too fast down into the tunnels, that's what would happen. And you can see the man standing here in the picture gives you an idea of this. Once it was completed and cleaned out, they sprayed concrete into the wooden forms and made a horseshoe-shaped tunnel about 12 feet in diameter. So that's how the water goes from one reservoir to the other. This is a shot of the dam at Quabbin Reservoir. And this was built in the late 1930s, as was its sister structure on the other side of the hill, the dike. This one is half a mile long, 175 feet high from the original riverbed, and it's not made out of concrete or blocks or anything like Watershed Reservoirs was. It's made out of fill. You can see they put rock rip-wrapping on the reservoir side to keep the reservoir from chewing away at it. The downstream side is grass. And there's a 2-lane road, you can drive across it almost any day of the year and take a look out over the reservoir, which is about 150 feet deep at this point. And below that structure you see at the right is a diversion tunnel which allows up to 20 million gallons a day of water to go out of the reservoir to keep the Swift River flowing downstream. So that is the Windsor Dam at Quabbin Reservoir, completed in 1939. Now, many of you are probably not familiar with how this process worked, how the people left the valley. Of course, the project began in late 1926, but the flooding didn't begin until 13 years later. Now, this newspaper cartoon would suggest something like people fleeing the Russian front in Eastern Europe in 1945. Well, it wasn't quite that drastic. But, again, this was not something your Dukakis liberal type people, well, didn't they have job relocation assistance and housing relocation assistance, and didn't they come in trucks? And no, nothing. You were sent a paper, please fill out this paper about your home and property. You filled it out, you sent it back in. They would send an appraiser to your house. Look it over, look over your property. Did you have any standing timber? Did you have any farmland? Do you have any little mill sites on your property, anything like that? Then they sent you an offer. If you accepted it, you would be sent a check, and once you cash the check, then you were expected to move out. Some people were allowed to stay on their property and rent it back from the Water Commission, especially if they worked on the project, which some people did, and the rents were quite reasonable. However, if you owned a store, all you were paid for was the land and the building. You were not paid anything for loss of trade, and you had to auction off your stock of material, or in one case, the guy did, picked up and moved it to another town and ran a store. There was no housing relocation assistance. You go find a new place to live. If you lost your job, tough luck. You go find a new job somewhere else. So that's why I say this was kind of a cold, cruel system, which is why some of the surviving people from this are still very resentful of the Boston area for this happening. And it's very shocking to people in their 20s and 30s to hear this. They can't imagine a world that wasn't like a Dukakis type of thing. But that did not exist in this, folks. And also the fact that the Great Depression hit during the middle of this project meant that the property values were very low, and people often get next to nothing for their land. And very few of them could afford lawyers to fight the battle for them. So that's a very sore point among a lot of people out that way, is the way this was done. And there were 40 cemeteries in the valley, 7,500 graves. Well, you can't have a submarine to go down and visit a grave. You don't want somebody's grave underneath a water supply you're going to drink. They had to dig them all up and move them. 5,500 of the graves were relocated, as is shown in this picture, at the Quabbin Park Cemetery in Ware, Massachusetts. That was created especially for this purpose. An Enfield grave is being reburied here in this scene. Often they dug down, they only found a different colored layer of dirt and a couple shoe buckles or something like that. Some of the bodies have been buried almost 2 centuries. But they had to dig it up and put it in a new box and rebury it. A couple thousand of the graves were removed at the request of descendants to other cemeteries in towns and places around the reservoir. So there are many Quabbin graves that are not in this cemetery. And they also have allowed employees and engineers of the Water Commission to be buried in this cemetery too in the years since. People who had a grave plot in the valley could have it transferred to this, so there are still people being buried here, and will be for a while. But unfortunately, this is a very pretty cemetery, nicely laid out, but there's no distinction between original cemetery or even original town. You need a chart to find a grave. They're just all scattered every which way. Typical callous engineering. The railroad I mentioned that ran through the valley, the Athol branch of the Boston Albany, between 1871 and 1935, connected Athol, the towns, and Springfield, Massachusetts. This is the first through train on the line in 1873 between both cities. You can see it's an old wood burner. This is an Enfield. Conductor Al Bennett is peeking out behind the tender there. He was a very famous conductor on this line for over 3 decades. It was affectionately known as the Soapstone Limited, or the Rabbit. One story is because of its 12.5 stops on its 47-mile length, there were many short hops between stations. The other story was it was so slow you could jump off, shoot a rabbit, and jump back on before it went by. Take your pick. It was a main artery of commerce for people in and out of the valley until the advent of the automobile. Some people even rode over it to go to high school. It was very sad for the Valley people when they bought it up and tore it up in 1935 so they could start work on the dam. And here's a shot of them tearing up the rails that summer. Now, by 1938, most of the people had moved out of the towns, and the 4 towns really had hardly anybody left to run them. Matter of fact, Prescott had been turned over to the Water Commission to manage in 1928. So the legislature passed a law providing for the 4 towns to be disincorporated, which is unique in the history of this state. And it was to take effect at 12:01 a.m. April 28, 1938. So knowing this a few weeks in advance, the Enfield Fire Department, not wishing to turn their money over to the state, which was going to happen to all the town's assets, decided to blow their whole budget on a farewell ball. And they wanted to get Spike Jones Band, but they ended up with McAnally's Orchestra, a famous dance band in the Connecticut River Valley, and they had a grand march and all that, but at midnight they stopped the music and there was hardly a dry eye in the house. This was held in the Enfield Town Hall, the only brick town hall in the valley. It was packed. People who had left years earlier came back for this event to say goodbye to their former friends and such, and it was quite a sad event. And of course, the next morning, the 4 towns didn't exist. My book, The Day 4 Quabbin Towns Died, is about what was going on in the valley on this day and the night of that farewell ball, which of course was 60 years ago next month. Now, some of you probably heard stories. Yeah, I took a fishing boat out on the Quabbin and I cast my line and I got my hook stuck in a church steeple and got the bell ringing. Well, ask them how much they've had to drink. This is a water supply reservoir. They do not leave buildings, trees, or other rottable organic things in the basin of it before they flood it. This is the site of Greenwich Village, which had a couple, 3 dozen homes. The last March before the flooding began. I don't see any church steeples or houses or much of anything. You see brush piles. Homes were either bulldozed into the cellar holes, burned, or in a very few cases taken down and rebuilt in other places. You see the Swift River East Branch, you see Route 21, you see some hills that are going to be islands in the reservoir, that's why they have trees. Other than that, it looks like a barren waste. As one valley resident said, like the skin of a man's shaved head before it was flooded. So let us end any rumors of all kinds of buildings and things under this reservoir. They didn't scrape up the topsoil, but they cut down anything that was more than a foot or 2 high. So there's only stone walls and roads and cellar holes under there, and mud. And no, there was no grandpa sitting on his front porch with a shotgun to keep the bad guys away with a boat, come to rescue him. They took everybody out of there before the flooding began. They don't want you doing your sanitary things every day with the water rising in the water supply reservoir. So let's scotch that little story too. The flooding began in the late summer of 1939. It took until the early summer of 1946 for it to fill and go over its spillway east of Windsor Dam, as shown here. We keep getting the kind of rainwater we're getting. It'll probably flood over again this coming spring. It did flood over quite a bit, not this winter, but the previous winter. Although it was very, very bone dry in the mid-60s during the great drought at that time. It covers 38.5 square miles and 412 billion gallon capacity. That's 7 times the size of Wachusett Reservoir. So it's a pretty big drink of water. And 1947, the Metropolitan Water Supply Commission was turned over to the Metropolitan District Commission Water Division to run. And in 1984, the water ownership was turned over to the Metropolitan Water Resources Authority, although the MDC Watershed Division still manages the property. For those of you who like bureaucratic technical knowledge, there it is. Now for the 4 lost towns. Dana in Worcester County was created in 1801 out of parts of Peter Sam Hardwick and Greenwich, probably named for a Boston judge. Had a couple major villages, Dana Common, the center village, and North Dana, the mill village, which was served by the railroad and State Highway 21, and several factories, a little hamlet called Doubleday Village in between. About 60% of the land of the town is still above the water, but because it was all in the watershed for the reservoir, they ended up taking over the thing and turning the land over to Peter Sam for legal purposes. Fairly well off town. It had paved roads, electricity, some telephone service, things like that, which wasn't the case with all the valley towns. Now, right if you go down Route 32A south of Petersham toward Hardwick, many of the roads that led into the reservoir area still exist, but they're gated off to keep motor vehicles out. Gate 40 is across the old road from Petersham to Dana Common. And right outside the gate is an almost completely filled-in cellar hole of this house, the Popcorn Snow residence. Popcorn Snow was a native of the town of Orleans on Cape Cod. He moved out here in the 1840s. Must have been an interesting man. After his first child died, his wife hung herself. So I don't imagine he was very good at consoling her or anything. He remarried and had another child by that wife. He was a vegetarian. Supposedly he lived mainly on milk and popcorn, hence the nickname Popcorn Snow. And he apparently, but even though he was a vegetarian, he didn't mind selling meat because he died dragging a pig carcass up his front steps to dress it. So obviously kind of a different mind there. What's most interesting about this guy is he had a metal coffin created, which was unusual in that place and time, and it had a window over where his face was going to be. Now, he died in November of 1873, and the deal was, when he died, the undertaker was supposed to visit his grave, which was in a tomb in a nearby private cemetery, for 7 days. And if he was still alive, he was going to knock on the pane of glass, and the undertaker, I'm not kidding, the undertaker was going to have to let him out and revive him. Well, after 3 days, the undertaker had done this. The fourth day, there was a horrible snowstorm. He managed to get to the house, and the widow said, well, if he wasn't dead by now, surely the cold and the storm has killed him. You don't have to go out there again. And, of course, his grave, like all the others, was taken up and brought down to Quabbin Park Cemetery in the 1940s. And some people insist his ghost comes back to the gravesite every Halloween or the anniversary of his death looking for his grave. So that's the story of Popcorn Snow in a nutshell. If you want to know more, there's a chapter on it in my Strange Tales from Old Quabbin book, which will tell you more somewhat interesting ghostly things about him. But that was his house. Now, about a mile and a half in from Gate 40, and it's a very nice walk, and I've led a lot of groups out there, is the site of Dana Common, the only town center above the water, wasn't flooded, and is accessible to the public. All these buildings I'm showing you are gone. Okay, this is what was, not what is. This isn't just an old picture of a pretty place now, like you can see old pictures of Bedford or something. This is what is gone. They're all cellar holes now. You're looking at the past here, folks. Just want to emphasize. You say, oh, what a pretty building. Can I go visit that? You can visit a picture. That's it. This is not like down the street. Oh, they tore down somebody's house, but all the other ones are still there. This, they tore down everything. So starting from the left on the northern side of Dana Common, you have the Eagle Hotel, and you have the Flag Residence. Second from the right is the 8th grade schoolhouse. These towns are too small to have a bank, a newspaper, or a high school. They all had to go to other towns to go to high school. Most of the kids here went over to Barry to go to high school. And the town hall. Now you can find the cellar holes of these buildings, especially the schoolhouse, on the northern side of that common. They're still very evident. Flipping over to the south side of the common, we have the store and post office. The Johnson Mansion, this was kind of the richest guy in town and their only state senator. He made a fortune in the palm leaf hat business. The Vaughan residence, which had a beautiful pebbled stone border wall, which is still standing, running all the way around it. People have painted it and photographed it. The ubiquitous Congregational Church, what New England common would be a common without a Congregational Church. And the Marcil residence down there on the end. There's a chapter about that in my Strange Tales book. Let's just say an attempted murder-suicide happened there. And you'll have to read the book to find out more. Naughty. Anybody know what that is? That's right, that's a dog. You can't bring a dog out into the Quabbin. You're not allowed to walk your dog out there because of its water supply nature. You can walk or bicycle out there yourself, but not drive out a vehicle or take a dog with you, or a horse, of course. So that's the southern side of Dana Common. Doubleday Village was a small hamlet between Dana and North Dana. At one time, 28 of its 35 residents were surnamed Doubleday, hence Doubleday Village. And of course, the only brick home in the village was the Elkanah Doubleday residence, shown here. This is the cellar hole. This is just above the water line. North Dana was a thriving mill village of the town. situated on the middle branch of the Swift River with the railroad passing through. The Goodman Hat Shop there on the right. The Crawford and Tyler Textile Mills here on the left. You can see a guy with his horse and buggy coming down from the hills to do his trading. The bridge over the river, the little bandstand, and the railroad crossing right there. Now behind these houses up on this hill, it's still above the water. But the water line is right about here, so you can see the village was pretty much all flooded, except for a couple of backyards. The only Catholic church in the Swift River Valley is in North Dana, St. Anne's Church, shown here on North Main Street. And again, the water line is just to the right out of the picture above the church. Some of the fixtures from this church were sent to a Catholic mission in Africa, so there's a little bit of Quabbin down in Africa, quite a distance away. This is the depot on the Rabbit Line in North Dana. The two-story Grange Hall is partly visible on the right. You can see the locomotive chugging in from Athol there. Some of the kids from North Dana rode this train up to Athol to go to high school. Notice the woman in white on the platform. I may have something to say about her a little later. By the way, that building was taken down and rebuilt in New Salem, the depot. This is a shot of North Main Street in North Dana. By the way, you'll notice a lot of these are from old postcards, which I both collect and deal in. They're an excellent way to illustrate what places looked like in our world about 80, 90 years ago. Now this one shows the part of the Crawford and Tyler Textile Mill I mentioned earlier. This is a boxcar on the railroad. This is one of the two bandstands in the valley. A little oak store here, and then this building with a fire tower, one of two fire stations in the Swift River Valley. The other one was in Enfield. The two largest villages had them. What's interesting is even though all these buildings are gone and the road and everything's all under the water, the last fire truck they used is still in existence. It is kept at the Swift River Valley Historical Society in North New Salem, Massachusetts, and it's still in running condition. 1929 fire truck. Now, the gentleman who's pictured at the wheel here, Bill O'Brien, died last year. He was in his 80s. He was the last surviving member of the Dana Fire Department. They used to take this truck out and run it in local parades until a few years ago. But he represents the fact that many of the former residents are passing among us. There are only a few dozen left. We're old enough to remember a lot. And of course, as time goes by, we'll soon lose them too. Enfield was the southernmost and largest of the four lost towns. It was in Hampshire County. Created in 1816 by parts of Greenwich and Belchertown. It was a fairly wealthy community. As a matter of fact, before the Civil War, it was the fourth wealthiest town in the state per capita. There were some manufacturing concerns in the Center Village and in Smith's Village, but a lot of good farms and dairy farms and such here too. The railroad and later state highways 21 and 109 passed through the town. Had some paved roads and electricity and phone service. The dam and the dike were both constructed at the southern ends of town to block off the Swift River Valley. That had about 1,000 people during most of its existence, the largest of the four towns. Here's a shot of it from the top of Quabbin Mountain before the reservoirs flooded. Today there is a tower on this mountain, and you can look out on the same view, but all you'll see is water and woods and such. Mount Pomeroy, an island in the reservoir which was in Greenwich, is up there. You can see the railroad running through from Smith's Village up here down to Enfield. There's Mount Ram, which is now one of the southern tips of the Prescott Peninsula, which divides the two major arms of the reservoir. Note the Methodist Episcopal Church at dead center of the picture. Okay, I'm going to show you a close-up from another picture of the town, and you'll see that church in it. This is Enfield, typical New England rural town. You can see that Methodist church. There's the grammar school, the brick town hall, the only one in the valley, a terrace cemetery running up the side of Mount Ram, the Congregational Church. You can see the Tebow Mill here. The Chandler Mansion, one of the first buildings sold to the Water Commission when the project started, and it was used as their office in the valley until the flooding began, and it was the last building taken down in 1940 in the town. The Hooker House over here. Now don't laugh, that was the name of the Hooker House. You know Fightin' Joe Hooker, his statue is on the State House lawn. His father was born in Enfield. And you're laughing at that word, of course. He was a bachelor, and he was a general. He was rather good looking. In the Civil War, he used to take women with him on his campaigns. I don't know, maybe they washed his clothes or something for him. But the soldiers, not having this privilege, called them hookers' girls. And then, of course, later they dropped the word girls and ended up calling them hookers. I'm sure his Enfield ancestors would have been shocked, but that's how the word supposedly came into our language. A little etymology there for you. So this is Enfield. This is rush hour in downtown Enfield about 90 years ago. Kind of like downtown Bedford in the old days, You can see, of course, again, all these buildings are gone. Starting from the right, we have the house, store, and post office, which was the home of 2 generations of postmasters, the local telephone exchange. It was the last post office in the valley. All the other buildings were gone when it was closed in January 1939, mainly serving project workers and such by that time. The Masonic Block is next, the Barlow Block and Payne Block. So this was the center of activity in the town of Enfield. The Swift River Hotel, a rather large hostelry in the center of town. Engineers, politicians, job seekers, whoever stayed here. The owner of it sold it off to the Water Commission in the late 20s. But so many of those people I just named were coming to visit here and look for jobs or whatever that they hired him back to run it as a hotel for several years to accommodate these visitors. We're told the building was taken down and rebuilt in Connecticut, but that hasn't been confirmed. This is the railroad station for Enfield and the freight house out in the back on the Rabbit Line, Enfield. Now, I have a chapter of my Strange Tales book. A man in Athol, his great-grandfather, he says, ran a hardware business in that town. And when this railroad came through in 1871, he decided to open a branch store in Enfield. He'd stay there a couple days a week, run the store, and then take the train back up to Athol to help manage his main store and be with his family. Well, it seems while he was in Enfield, he took a fancy to a young lady, and I guess in the end we could call him a commuter bigamist. Well, news traveled slowly in those days, but eventually the Athol wife found out about the Enfield life and kind of put her foot down or made him get honest or whatever. And, of course, in 1873 they had what they used to call a panic or a depression, and business got real slow. So it seems that at some point he shut down his Enfield store, packed up his stock into a boxcar, and proceeded to head back to Athol, leaving the poor Enfield wife standing there on the tracks wondering what happened to him. Maybe she slept in that boxcar. Remember the woman in white on the platform in North Dana? Maybe she got arrived that far up looking for him. Well, out of everything I tell you tonight, that's the only thing I can't swear to the truth of, but it makes a good story to go with this slide, so there you have it. This was Smith's Village, a half-mile upstream in Enfield on the Swift River, dominated by the Smith's woolen mill. The last inheritor of the property was the first person in this part of the state to own a Rolls Royce in the 1920s. You can see there were a few bucks left there. The hill in the background, Little Quabbin Mountain, now an island in the reservoir, was the site of motorcycle hill climbs in the early 1930s. They used to race the old Indian motorcycles they made out of Springfield. If you could find one of those sitting around in decent shape in somebody's barn, you could get a few bucks, I'm sure. Quite desirable, but this business dominated the village, and of course they had a stop on the railroad there. Greenwich. Everybody else apparently says Greenwich. These people said Greenwich. The longest town, the mother town of the valley, was the first one incorporated. Later it lost its northeastern chunk to Dana and the southwestern piece to Enfield. What ended up was about 8 miles long, 2 or 3 miles wide, quite flat, just dotted by a few hills, which later became islands in the reservoir. Not the best soil for agriculture, and only a little bit of industry in Greenwich Village. The other major village was Greenwich Plains, the center village. You see the railroad ran through the town, and later State Highway 21. Well watered, the east branch and middle branch of the Swift River joined in the southwestern part of town. And these lakes and ponds later attracted many summer campers starting around 100 years ago. So it's quite a little tourist area. Never very wealthy, only had about 700 or 800 people at its peak after it lost territory to the other towns. But This is the Common in Greenwich. Pretty big Common. They could play the Super Bowl on that pretty safely. What you have here is the Congregational Church, the old hotel, and the store post office here. The second store post office replaced a building that burned a year or two before this picture was taken. Now, if you were on this spot today, all the buildings and trees would be gone. You'd be drowning because the water level at this point is above the level of the old treetop and steeple. Pretty deep. Quabbin Inn, overlooking Quabbin Lake in the eastern part of Greenwich, was quite a popular hostelry. People would ride the train up from Springfield or down from Athol to stay here. There was a little covered area there, partway down the hill. People would swim, hunt, fish. They even had a bowling alley in the place. By the way, Quabbin is an old Nipmuc Indian word meaning great waters, well-watered place, place of many waters, which was very appropriately given to the site of the future reservoir in 1932 to the behest of engineer Carl Tennyson. When this was abandoned and sold off to the state during the 1930s, some nudists tried to rent it for their use. I know the Depression was pretty tough on people, but I didn't think they were so poor they had to run around naked. But nonetheless, the Water Commission did not think they were the kind of people they wanted there, so they turned them down. This shot, beautiful postcard shot, is the center of Greenwich Village, which was the other major village in the town. You can see Walker's store and post office there on the right. Walker's Mills, they had a box shop there. Notice, even though the dirt roads, you'd have both horses and buggies and an automobile going through the village. So they were kind of getting into the 20th century, although there was almost no electricity or phone service or whatever in this town, and only one paved road. Pretty rural. By the way, the other store in the village, run by a man named Frank P. Hall, we have one of his descendants here in the room tonight, as he indicated to me earlier. So you might find that of interest. Now, there was a golf course in Greenwich. It was started in 1926 by a couple of wealthy men from a Springfield factory. They bought a farm between Curtis Hill and Curtis Pond, laid out a rather sandy 9-hole golf course, and built this cute little stone clubhouse. And, of course, they'd ride up the rabbit train on the weekends and stay here, and sometimes they brought their wives with them, and sometimes they brought other women with them. And even though it was prohibition, they were known to have a generous supply of good things to drink. Some of the local boys made some money caddying for these Springfield big shots, but the most interesting thing about this is they probably spent about $40,000 between buying the land and building the clubhouse and laying out the golf course. But lo and behold, when it came time to sell this all to the state, somehow it was worth $500,000. Between what they said they did and these paper subdivisions they did, going up and down hills and through swamps and whatever. After 3 court cases, they ended up settling for a little under $200,000. They had good lawyers and bucks. They made out like bandits. Not like most of the people in the valley. And the ultimate irony is, without its roof, this building is still standing. It's on an island in the reservoir, so they didn't bother to take all the stone stuff out. They just took the roof and innards out. And the chimney and the pillars and the steps are still there on Curtis Hill Island in the reservoir. So it's a rather quaint monument to some rather interesting people in their scheme. The Dugmar Golf Course. Prescott, the last of the 4 towns, in case any of you are getting itchy. This was the youngest and least populated town of the 4. It was created in 1822 out of southern New Salem and eastern Pelham. And if you look at the shape of it, you can probably tell which came from what. Most of it was on a large ridge running north to south, which ended up dividing the western arm of the reservoir from the eastern arm of the reservoir, so it's called the Prescott Peninsula. The railroad ran through the eastern extreme of town at Soapstone Crossing. Very little industry here. It was mostly basic agriculture, berries, potatoes, that kind of thing. Prescott Hill was the so-called center village, now the site of a radio astronomy facility that's run by the colleges in the Amherst area. Prescott or Atkinson Hollow, a little hamlet here, and North Prescott was on the border of New Salem and Prescott. Those were the major villages. Daniel Shays of Shays Rebellion fame lived right here when it was Pelham East Parish. And he later ended up fleeing to New York after his rebellion failed. No electricity or telephone service, no paved roads, pretty old-fashioned hill town. This was the Congregational Church. Now, what's curious about Prescott is even though it was the smallest and poorest town, quite a few of its buildings were taken down and rebuilt in other places. This one is relocated near Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts. It's called the Skinner Museum. They added a spire to the church, but other than that, the building looks pretty much the same on the outside. Notice the old horse barn out back. This was the town hall. I could say pretty safely we could fit it inside this room. That's how small it is. And you'll see part of a graveyard out in back of it there to the left. This building was taken down and rebuilt in Petersham, Massachusetts by a New York judge. Had it placed on his summer home, and you can see it from Route 32, north of the town. The Atkinson Hollow Tavern, later the Dr. Clark House, in the hamlet of that name. Any of you ever been to the Big E, the Eastern States Exposition in West Springfield? They have a recreated village there called Storatown Village. This building is now there with an addition, and it is a rather expensive restaurant. The Storatown Tavern, they call it. So, if you like Tony Meals in 20 places at the Big E, this is the place to go. Probably better food than the stuff they sell out of those little carts and things, but you'll pay for it. So that was a Prescott building. North Prescott, this is an interesting winter shot. Kind of reminds you of what we're hoping we're not going to see much of anymore, snow. This village was located partly in New Salem and partly in Prescott. And it was also right on the border of the land taking areas for the Watershed. So as a result, the building on the far left, which was the store and post office and had a dance hall, that's gone, wiped out to cellar hole. The church in the center was taken down and moved twice, and 10 years ago it ended up in North New Salem at the Swift River Valley Historical Society complex. It doesn't have a steeple, but it's there and they use it as their meeting hall and such. The building on the right was the parsonage. That is still standing on its site. Between the two cellar holes on the left is a fence that was built across the whole northern edge of the Prescott Peninsula during World War II. They used it for bombing practice out of Westover Air Force Base. So they built the fence across to keep people out of there. And then after the war, they said, let's call it a wildlife sanctuary and we'll still keep people out of there. So that's what they do. Now, what's interesting about this village is that it seems the farmers who lived on the border of these two towns watched what the tax rates were every year, and they had the boundary flipped to put them in whichever town had the cheaper tax rate. Kind of a neat trick to beat Prop 2.5. Huh? Anyway, the state stepped in around 1910 and said, look, pick sides and we're going to have the border. Because at one time that church was in one town or the other or halfway in between. Finally ended up in Preston. And by the way, out of the picture to the right is a graveyard, the old South New Salem Cemetery, which is still there and it has many Prescott graves in it. You can walk right up to it and visit it. Now, I have several shots here of what life was like in North Prescott around 1910, 1915. For those of you who grew up in a small town, perhaps as late as the 1930s, you might remember some things like this. Others of you who are city folk might find this all rather quaint because it's nothing like what life was like in Boston or Cambridge or Dorchester or the streetcar places or any of that kind of stuff. This is rural New England, folks. Of course, I like to tell the kids, you go down to the Quickie Lube and, they do your oil change and you're out of there in 15, 20 minutes. Well, in those days, you had to take your horse to the blacksmith and have him reshod. So somebody hitched the horse to the buggy, rode down to the blacksmith and brought the horse in. They probably did some good gossiping while they were there. And the blacksmith put some new shoes on the horse, went out, hitched him back up to the buggy and went home. And you can see an old buckboard wagon there off to the right. Probably blacksmith got his stuff through that or something. Here's the mailman. No little white Jeeps or minivans or anything here. This guy picked up the mail in Orange at the railroad station, and he ran a 12-mile route on his horse and cart, 5 days a week, and he did it for several decades. A man named Earl Whitaker. And he ran down through southern Orange, parts of South New Salem and North Prescott and Cooleyville. Quite a quaint-sounding group of places. By the way, his son Ray, who is still alive, recently penned a book about his memories of growing up in Prescott, and he was a member of the State Fish and Wildlife Board for a number of years. Now, this man and his rig, it all kind of looks quaint, but remember, it was 2 cents to mail a letter in those days. Now it's 32 cents, and I don't know if it's much faster. Here's one of the 5 one-room schools in Preston. We could definitely fit that building in this room, no doubt about it. No fancy brick stuff or big, huge plate glass windows or anything here. You'll notice there's a big pile of wood off to the right. That's how they heated the place, folks. Didn't flick up the thermostat or something. The teacher, whose head is visible in the window, I interviewed her before she died a few years ago at the age of 99. Her name was Annis LaPlante. And she told me that if a kid was bad on a particular day, that kid would have to come in an hour early the next day. These kids walked as much as 2.5 miles to get to school, by the way. No buses here. And would have to stoke up the stove with some wood from the pile to warm it up. If nobody was bad, they drew straws to see who got to do it. So that was the 3 R's back in those days. Pretty crude, but they learned it. I think they were a better class of kids than most of the ones there nowadays. Okay, we have the horse barn behind the North Prescott Church. Now, with all due respect to what you were talking about during your meeting, these people didn't go out and file for community development grants or HUD funds or UDAG grants or any of that stuff. They said, well, let's have a bake sale or a Chinese auction, and they raised some money, went out and bought some shingles and boards, and had a roof raising on some Saturday afternoon. The women were probably enlisted to bake something for the men to eat. You can see they're using everything from boards to old doors to hold up their scaffolding, and they're all proudly posing here. But in those days, it was Yankee ingenuity. They needed to fix something, they went out and did it themselves. And that's something to be applauded. Now again, we didn't go to the store and buy a nice clear plastic jug of milk. In those days, you either had your own milk cows, or Ellis Pierce here would bring you milk in his milk wagon. Now what's interesting about this picture, you notice there are leaves on the trees, and he has a canopy over his seat, but there's no canopy over the milk jugs. And a couple of years ago, I finally found out why. He's bringing the milk to the railroad station to ship it to you city people. So they didn't care if it got hot in the sun. That's the truth. So how's that, folks? Must have been pretty creamy by the time they got it. This is my favorite picture. This is the Prescott Highway Department with their piece of equipment. Notice I said piece. This was it, other than shovels and picks and whatever. Okay, you see the horse's rear end on the right there, pulling this whole thing. Frank Newell is steering the rig with reins on the horse. Harry Haskins, you'll notice, is steering the blade. But what the hell is Austin Gross doing standing there picking his nails? Typical road crew, 3 men doing the work of 2. See, I've insulted politicians, engineers, mailmen. Did I miss anybody? I suppose he reaches down and turns that wheel right at his feet once. Notice he's got a real neat hat, too. He's got plenty more shade than the other 2 guys. The town of dirt roads, Prescott, so every spring they had to go through with this horse-drawn grader and grade down the frost heaves. So that's how they did it in those days, folks. Prescott Highway Department, in action. Okay, besides those 4 towns, 7 other towns I mentioned lost territory to the watershed takings or flooding. New Salem lost 2/3 of its territory, including the prosperous village of Millington. Now, even though it was only a village of New Salem, it's had its own village hall, shown here, Moore Hall, its own light company, its own telephone company, its own brick village schoolhouse, which most of the other ones in town were wood, a creamery, a store, post office, and a grist mill. And they had a farewell dinner in this building in May of 1938 before it was torn down. Nichawag was a hamlet in the southern part of the town of Petersam, which had a couple of mills, one of which was shown here, and a few other things, a store and a post office, a school and such. Since it was on the east branch of the Swift River, not terribly far from where it flows into the reservoir, or an arm of it, they had to buy up most of the territory here. There are only a few houses in the vicinity nowadays. That's why you still see it on some road maps. That was the original Native American name for the area of Petersam, Nichawag. Pelham lost its eastern third, including a village called Bobbinville or Bobbin Hollow or Pelham Hollow. And the reason it got that name was they had a mill that made sewing machine bobbins. Plenty of wood, you got a dam, so you could have water power, so they cranked out sewing machine bobbins. This was the village near which Daniel Shays lived. And here's a map of the reservoir, as it was finally finished. You can see the reservoir in blue, and the green area around it, the watershed territory. Off to the east here, the Ware River watershed area, the tunnel line. During the 60s, when the water was real low, they thought about trying to take water out of the Connecticut River in Northfield and run it into the Quabbin, which would, of course, get any waste from the nuclear plant up in Vernon, Vermont, would bring lamprey eels from the Connecticut River into the Quabbin, and dirtier water. That was bandied about quite a while until the late 70s, and it was finally killed off, although it's not completely out of the picture. It's kind of in the far back burner. So that is the reservoir area as it looks today on map. This is a shot of the water system. When I made this slide, the MWRA hadn't been thought of, so you should now call it the MWRA water system, starting with the Quabbin. By the way, 3 communities that are suburbs of Springfield, Chicopee House, South Hadley, and Wilbraham, do get water out of the reservoir, but all the rest of the water heads east. So you have the aqueduct from the Quabbin over to the Ware River area where water can be picked up, and then it goes to the Wachusett Reservoir. And from there, aqueducts, including the new Metro West Tunnel, will take it into the Metropolitan area. You people in Bedford are up in here. You weren't on the system at the time, so you're not a bulge in the map yet here. And they do have various lines and tunnels and things to take it up as far northeast as Marblehead. So that's the water system. The Swift River Valley Historical Society, of which I was a member of the board of directors in the early 1980s, is in an original homestead on that site in North New Salem, known as the Whitaker-Clary House, and that is the headquarters for Quabbin history. There's no Quabbin Historical Society. This is it. It covers the 4 lost towns in New Salem. It was created in the mid-30s. Each room of the house represents a different one of those towns, and of course out of the picture to the left is that old North Prescott Church, which has the Prescott material in it, and their office. They're open on Wednesday and Sunday afternoons in July and August, and on Sunday afternoons in September. They have an annual meeting, one in June and one in September on a Saturday. Membership is $5 a year. It's $3 to get in, so if you're going to go more than once, you might as well join. And they do have a newsletter occasionally. That's the place if you want to look up Quabbin genealogy or artifacts or whatever. The old bread barn there used to house that Dana fire truck. They have another newer building that's out of the picture to the left behind the house. This is what Dana Common looked like a few years ago. The roads are still there, the triangular green. Many of the pine trees have since been harvested because they do a lot of that there to, number one, to make money for you ratepayers, and also to keep them, you know, if they just get too big and they die and they fall down, they're not going to do anything anyway. The front tree now in the picture is gone, and a small marker has been erected to note the site of that is the site of Dana Common. This is the administration building at the Quabbin. It was built in the late 30s, Dutch colonial style brick structure. They made a seaplane hangar there, but they never put a seaplane in it. They use it for trucks and fishing boats and such, store them in there. That building houses the soil and water testing laboratories, the Quabbin Visitor Center, and a state police barracks. So if you go skinny dipping in the reservoir and they catch you, they'll arrest you. That's located off Route 9 in Belchertown, by the way. The Visitor Center is open almost every day of the year. The Friends of Quabbin, of which I'm a member of the board of directors, is a support group for that organization. This is the summit tower on Quabbin Mountain overlooking the site of the reservoir. And you can drive right up to about where the cameraman was standing, and then you can walk up to that doorway right there. And then you have to climb 5 flights of stairs. There's no handicapped elevator or anything here, folks. But if you get up into that glassed-in area, you can see almost the whole reservoir on a clear day, and areas toward the Berkshires and northern Connecticut. It's quite a view from up there. And they have those little view machines, you know, you stick a quarter in and kind of steer it and focus it, and you can see a lot closer. Always bring more than 1 quarter. By the time I get the damn thing focused, the first quarter's run out. This is a Memorial Day ceremony of recent vintage at the Quabbin Park Cemetery. Now, as I mentioned to you, 5,500 of the valley graves were moved here, and also some of the monuments from the towns. In this picture, you can see the building where the burial records and tools are stored. This was the Civil War statue that was in Enfield. This is the cannon that was on Dana Common. There are 2 or 3 other monuments here too. Every Sunday before Memorial Day, they hold a ceremony here in honor of the veterans from these towns, which is co-sponsored by the Friends of Quabbin. This is our final shot here. This is a view of the Quabbin Reservoir from the Enfield lookout, which is located up on a hillside halfway between the dam and the dike. You can drive right up to this spot and park here. Don't have to do any hiking. This is a good place to look for the Quabbin eagles, although the best time for that is passed by, which is during the winter months. Sometimes they come down onto the ice, look for carcasses or fish in the water or whatever, but usually in the cold months of the year. Now, the reason it's called Enfield Lookout, this is Mount Ram, which I mentioned earlier. The site of Enfield is right here under the water. That's the northern tip of Little Quabbin Mountain Island, and there's Mount Pomeroy in what was Greenwich. Does anybody know what this mountain is way off to the north? That's right, Mount Monadnock. Good guess. So you can see pretty far from this site. Now, the Quabbin, of course, supplies over 2 million people with water, including you people as of recently in the town of Bedford. And it is, as Tom Connuel called it, an accidental wilderness. It was created for a water supply, so very little recreation is allowed there. Hiking, bicycling, some shore and boat fishing, and occasionally these deer hunts to try to keep the population down so the forest can regenerate properly. But they don't allow sailboating or swimming or camping or any of that other stuff there. It's a water supply reservation, not a state park per se. And it is a beautiful place. It's an inspiring place. It's a fun place to bird watch or fish or picnic or whatever. But I always remember the tragedy of the 2,500 people who had to move out and lose their homes and livelihoods and such for this. So while you see the physical beauty, remember the sad human story behind its creation. With that, I'll ask for the lights and ask for any questions.
Where did they get the water? In the very beginning, where did the water come from?
Okay. Make sure our man has me in the right pose here. The water comes from the 3 branches of the Swift River. That's what was dammed up to flood it out. And also, at times, they have put water from the Ware River into it as well. Any other questions? No? Oh, yes.
The Swift River that comes out at the bottom?
That's what comes out of
That
Windsor
one
Dam,
single
yes,
branch?
1 branch. Yeah, 3 branches flow into it and 1 branch comes out. There's also another Swift River, by the way, that's up in the Cummington area or at the foothills of the Berkshire. Completely different thing. There's just 2 Swift Rivers in this state. Yes, sir?
Do you know where they intend to put filter beds?
Well, they're currently arguing about that whole thing, but I believe it is east of the Wachusett Reservoir, somewhere in the Marlborough area. That's the latest proposal as I understand it. The whole question is as to whether or not they're fighting with the Environmental Protection Agency right now, who said that they have to do that, not just treat it, and they're saying they don't have to do that. So they're going through a battle on that right now because that would add another couple $100 million to the cost of the ratepayers. Any other questions?
How long will this take care of need?
Well, when it was built, it was expected it would last about 50 years, and it has now lasted almost 60. Presumably, at the current rate that water conservation and the high water rates have kept down the use, it could last for another 2 or 3 or 4 decades. That raises the question of would they go to the Connecticut River, would they try to drill wells, or what? It's really not known exactly what they could do, but for the near foreseeable future, it seems to be adequate. Yes, sir, you had a question.
I don't mean to embarrass him, but our guest tonight, Mr. Skinner, is probably the only one here whose family came from one of the towns, Greenwich. And
Yes, I referred to that earlier, yeah.
Oh, maybe
Yep.
you'd like to say a few words? about his reminiscences.
I can remember a little of it because I was about 8 or 10 years old at the time. But I do remember that the huge rocks that were being brought in, he referred to my grandfather as being the owner of the general store and postmaster of Greenwich Village. I remember the store. I remember the fact that he had no electricity in town, but the lighting was from these lamps that were brought down on counterweights and then brought back up. Remember the candy counter in there. My sisters got in trouble with that. Remember the gardens that he had out back. It was a tragic time. It was really quite a time for all of these families. My mother's sister lived in Enfield with her husband, and he was a mechanic, and they moved from Enfield to Amherst and continued to work with the same company. And the name of the company is the name of the same Chevrolet dealership that was here in Lexington. Anybody remember the name?
Johnson.
Rowe. That's the name. R-O-W-E. He moved from Enfield to Amherst, and my uncle and his family moved to Amherst.
Yeah, Rose Garage was the automobile dealership, in Enfield.
He worked there up into his 70s, and he finally retired. Of course, he wasn't working full-time in the last of the times that he was there. But my grandfather moved from Greenwich Village to West Boylston, and I remember going down and seeing that church there, and he ran a little garden, and he delivered garden foods around the town. So that's what happened to him. But,
what's interesting is he moved a little further away than most of the people in the valley. Most of them moved within 10 or a dozen miles from there. Athol, Barry, Ware, Palmer, Amherst. His grandfather went further away than most of the valley people did when they moved.
I remember one picture you showed here of the Quabbin Lake. Right down at the bottom it said published by Frank P. Hall.
Yes, he did make some of the postcards of the village that he sold out of his store.
Some of those out here in the car too. And the family did have a cottage on the lake.
Oh yeah.
That was. But it really was a time. The family does have a lot at Quabbin Lake.
Quabbin Park Cemetery, right? Yeah.
In the cemetery. My mother is buried there. My father will be buried there. There are other lots. I could be buried there because I'm still a member of the family that was at that point. It's very
interesting.
Thank you very much.
Yes, well, it's good to hear from someone who had been there. Any other questions before we conclude? Yes, sir.
Maybe not before I conclude. I didn't want to steal your thunder, but we quite often have a Bedford history section. So I went into our archives, and there we have a pamphlet, 8-page pamphlet dated 1886. And it is the closing arguments of Elihu G. Loomis, Esquire, against granting the petition of the city of Boston to take the waters of the Shawshene River before the Committee on Water Supply. And so
you can see their tentacles were spreading all over, so they even looked into Bedford. Isn't that interesting? Yes, so good point. Good point. So they also looked up at the Ipswich River up in the northeastern part of the state, but those people managed to keep it kept out of the whole idea for this, as that was looked upon as one of the potential sources as well. Okay, well again, I thank you for having me here. I hope you enjoyed it. I've got my books and things you can come up here and look at, and the maps and pictures, and thank you again.
I want to remind you, don't forget, April, we're going on a bus ride. It's going to be fun. And I'm sure there'll be more people that will sign up. But I don't know if you have anything to say about it.
Nothing more. No, the meeting
Thank you for coming.
The meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much for coming.
I didn't get a chance to, remember the road grader?
Yes, yeah, flat top grader, yeah. That's right. Wheel down below.